Suzanne Ellsworth, and I am the regent of the Lakeland chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution.
And I'm J. Lenora Bressler, the first Vice Regent of the chapter.
Thank you so much for joining us and supporting our fundraising initiative.
We hope you will have a frightfully enjoyable time with us tonight and with Ghosts of the Revolution. A favorite pastime of the revolutionary generation was the telling of ghost stories. In fact, in 1840, when Charles Dickens visited America for the first time, he remarked upon the almost obsession Americans seemed to have with the supernatural and spectral apparitions. But he rightly concluded that this was not something new. Oh no, it had gone back to pre-Revolutionary War times. In fact, many scholars think that it was the Americans' obsession with ghost stories that inspired Charles Dickens to write, 2 years later, the most famous of all ghost stories, A Christmas Carol. Telling ghost stories around campfires or around fireplaces was very popular in colonial times. What else would you do in a frontier society when the night fell? A lot of these stories, especially the ones that you're going to hear tonight, were related as if they were true, and indeed there are newspaper and gazette accounts of these stories, so at least the nuggets have been presented as authentic. These stories were more often than not cautionary tales directed primarily at young people. There were real dangers in colonial times of which they needed to be made aware, and the stories were always presented in a way that made the listener think this could indeed happen to them. Old houses have their stories, and some tell them again and again and again. There is a house across the Ware River in Gloucester County. It stood since Puritan times. Now it's a ramshackle, rambling mansion today because successive generations of its inhabitants have added their own revisions and additions, kind of a conglomeration of the history of architectural design of the last 350 years. But the original foundation is there, as well as the large, if rather simple, house. And that is the story that I'm going to tell you now. Oh, this house has seen its share of human activities. It's seen births, christenings, marriages, and yes, sickbeds and deathbeds. It has heard the pitter-patter of happy feet running to a nursery and the slow, uneven tread of the elderly marching to their final sleep. It is, in general, a happy house, except for one night every year. And it always happens the exact same way. It goes like this. Whatever's the family of the moment is seated somewhere downstairs, happily talking or reading, when suddenly they hear something. It sounds like someone's moving in the chamber above, a chamber that has long been uninhabited. It sounds almost as if a log is being dragged across the floor and then thrown into a fireplace that was long ago pent up. Then they can almost hear the crackle of a fire. And my goodness, they can smell the oppressive heat of a smoke-filled room. Then they can hear something else, something over by the door. A door that was once the front door of the home long ago, but is now just an interior door, but sounds for all the world as if it is a dog, perhaps, scratching to be let in. At that moment, every year, generally at dusk and usually in November, the family will look at each other
and a unsteady and uneasy silence comes across the room. They look at each other, wondering, who will it be this year? Finally, someone rises and goes over to the shuttered window, pulls back the curtains, and looks outside, and always says the same thing. It's snowing, the first snow of the season. In colonial times, there was a very prominent and wealthy family by the name of Throckmorton. Oh, they were wealthy, prestigious, and it so came to be that in one of those generations there were two sons. The elder was to inherit the title, the property, and most of the money. The younger one was going to have to basically fend for himself and his own industrious nature. Well, the older brother was sent back to England for proper schooling, while the younger one was left here. There was some kind of a disagreement within the family, so severe that the older brother stayed much longer in England than was originally desired. In fact, the disagreement, whatever it was in the family, was so intense that both the parents and the younger brother stopped talking about the elder brother altogether, so that many in the community forgot that there even was an elder brother. And that meant that many people, particularly those new to the society, thought that the younger brother was the heir apparent to the Throckmorton fortune. But there was one young lady who remembered the truth, who knew that the younger Throckmorton was not the wealthy to be titled master of the manor, but she loved him anyway. Her name was Jenny, and she was a village girl, and she saw him for the good-hearted, kind, and generous young man that he was. They were friends, but as is often the case with childhood friendships, the familiarity obscures the passion that might have come to be. Oh, she felt it for him, but he not for her. And so he became, besotted when a cousin of a nearby neighbor came to visit one summer. Oh, was he besotted. And within a few weeks, they were engaged to be married. 1 week before the wedding, the elder brother suddenly returned. And interestingly, the fiancée of the younger now found herself madly in love with the elder brother. Yes, shall we say she was ambitious as well as beautiful and charming? She wound up marrying the elder brother. The younger brother fell into a skepticism, a cynicism, and dare I say a depression from which most people thought he would never return. It seemed that he had no interest whatsoever in love affairs, and so threw himself into his business, thinking that he had to make his own way in the world. It turned out that he was quite good, as it happened, and made a great deal of money. His father did not die easily. He kept on living, which was fine with the younger Throckmorton, as he was very fond of his parents and very fond of his sire. As his father lay on his deathbed, the news came to the family that the elder brother, who was still childless, and his wife had perished in a shipwreck. That meant that the minute the father died, the younger Throckmorton would inherit the title, the property, and all the family wealth. When his father did die, the younger Throckmorton became the richest man in the county. Now, it just so happened that right about that time, his old childhood friend Jenny was no longer married. She had become a widow, and they struck up an old friendship born of, long-pent memories. And passion flared. And so the two found themselves entering the autumn of their life with the spring of new and fresh love. They were shocked, after they married, to find that their joy would be added to by the birth of a child. Yes, a girl, who was very much like her mother, but also had her own unique and wonderful attractions. It was a very happy family. And the wealthy man bestowed every bit of his wealth on his two girls, as he called them. He loved to wrap them in the finest silks and give them the best of jewels. He loved to put rings on every single one of their fingers. Oh, yes, he spoiled his daughter, but in all the best ways. But then, as fate would have it, a fever swept through, and his beloved Jenny died, leaving the father and daughter by themselves. They clung to one another. They became each other's best friends as well as parent and child. And no one could have loved with a more sincere love than those two. But as time went by, the girl fell in love with a boy. Now, the boy had been, interestingly enough, a cousin of a neighbor. And it reminded Mr. Throckmorton of his betrayal. He warned his child that this man, this lover, was only interested in her money, and so he forbade her to see him. She was not happy, but she was a dutiful and loving daughter, and so she sent the young man away. However, it doesn't seem to have been true love, at least on her part, for she soon grew heartsick and died. And so it was on a bleak and dreary November evening that a grief-ridden father carried his beautifully jewel-bedecked, silk-brocaded, swathed corpse of a daughter up the hill behind his house to be buried. It was terrible. The servants literally had to pull the man away after 3 hours of non-stop crying by his dear departed daughter's grave. But finally, it was getting night, and the first snow was starting to fall of the season. There was a chill in the air that just chilled one to the very bone, and so they took their master back. He had never been given to drink, but decided that perhaps it was time for him to find out if a little bit of whiskey did indeed dull the senses enough to put grief at bay for a few hours. And so he went up to his chambers, dragged a log into the fire, stoked the fire, and then took out a whiskey bottle and a glass. You could hear the clink of it through that solitary house, and he began to drink himself into oblivion. Now, meanwhile, back at the gravesite, 2 servants slipped out of the Throckmorton house, greedy men who had thought it was very interesting that the kind father could not bear to take away the jewels from his daughter's fingers, and so they dug up the grave. And yes, they removed the bracelets and the necklaces, and then one by one they lifted the poor dead girl's fingers and removed the rings until they got to one ring. It was large, it was red like blood, and it shined in the light, very similar to this one. But they could not get it off the swollen finger of the girl, and so they most maliciously and callously grabbed a knife and sliced her finger right off of her hand, taking the finger and the ring with them. The girl had been only in a coma. Yes, she was not actually dead. And so this brought her back to life, the shock of it. But she was in falling snow, almost frozen, and blood was dripping, flowing from her body. With the little bit of strength she had left, she rose from her grave and she clawed her way across the hills back to the house that she loved, back to the father that loved her. Completely destitute of strength, she scratched at the door. Her throat was so constricted she could not even speak, and so she clawed and clawed at the door. But her father thought it was just a dog trying to get in from the cold, and he was too drunk to care about it. The next morning, the father came downstairs and started to open the door. It would not open, it would not budge. He thought it must have been quite a snow if the snowbanks were that thick. So he pushed harder and harder still. And finally he realized it was no snowbank. It was his own daughter, covered in snow, with blood that had dripped the entire trail from her grave to his front door. Grieving again, this father had to take his poor, frozen, twice dead child back to the grave. And so, on the anniversary of that occurrence, every year, the same thing happens. It's as if the house must tell the story over and over. Is it a warning to us? What exactly is it? I don't know. I don't claim to know, but I do know this. Houses speak their stories. The question is, are you listening? Yes, you best be careful lest you bury someone alive. Premature burial was a true danger in colonial days. In fact, corpses have been exhumed that showed scratchings on the interior of the caskets, testifying that people had been buried alive and were scratching to try to get out. If you've ever heard the saying, saved by the bell, this refers to the practice of gravediggers of leaving a string inside new caskets that would be attached to a bell and monitored for 3 days after the funeral. That way, if someone had been buried prematurely, they could pull on the string and literally be saved by the bell. In addition to the danger of premature burial, this story suggests it is not a wise thing to bury people with their jewelry. In fact, grave robbing became such a problem in colonial times that for a period of time it became illegal to bury anyone with anything of value.
As the story goes, Lady Mary had very good prospects for a most prosperous wedding and family because she was both fetching and she came from a good family. But apparently none of the eligible suitors were good enough for her, and no, she chooses one Mr. Fox, albeit a handsome man and arguably a successful businessman by all accounts. But here's where the story grows odd. For no one, including Lady Mary, knows who this Mr. Fox is. They know nothing about him. The mysterious Mr. Fox told no one where his house was, except to Lady Mary, but in a very cryptic manner. In fact, he said it was over 7 hills, through 7 valleys, and across 7 streams to his castle. How odd. Now, the courting of Lady Mary and Mr. Fox was progressing, so much so that the day of signing the engagement contract was hastening. Yet Lady Mary found that she knew nothing more of Mr. Fox than she had at the beginning. Now, Lady Mary is nothing if she's not plucky, and so she decided to find that house, for she reasoned that if he would lie about the house, certainly he would lie about other things as well. So on the morrow, Lady Mary got on her horse. She rode over 7 hills, through 7 valleys, and across 7 streams. And guess what? There was the beautiful castle. She hides her horse. She goes to the drawbridge, where she immediately sees a sign. And not just a normal sign, but an odd sign. It read, "Be bold, be bold." What does that even mean? She crosses the drawbridge. She goes into the courtyard, and there to her right was a door with a second sign. Now this one gave her pause. was. For it says, be bold, but not too bold. Well, Lady Mary, she'd come all this way. She wasn't going to let a sign stop her now. So she went in, through the hallway, up the stairs, through a gallery, and then to a door on the left that had a third sign. Now this one caused her trepidation, and it would you too, gentle listener. For it said, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood run cold. Well, I wouldn't have entered in, but Lady Mary, as I said, she's plucky. Taking a deep breath, she entered the room, much to her never-ending horror. For there she saw the rotting corpses and skeletons of young maidens, murdered, blood through their hair, down through their gowns. Now, like any sane person would, Lady Mary leaves this abattoir, this slaughterhouse of young maidens, runs through the hall, down the stairs, out to the hallway, and just as she's about to leave, she sees through a window Mr. Fox dragging a maiden by her hair into the castle, the very hallway that she's in. And like you, she was panic-stricken what to do. But there was a large cask right near the door, and she squeezes her way into it, just in time, dear listener, because Mr. Fox drags this woman who appears to be either dead or in a stupor. He goes about 20 paces, and then Lady Mary sees that he's looking at her hand, but she doesn't know why. And then she sees he's trying to pull something off. It must be a ring, a diamond ring. Now, guess what? He can't pull it off. Now, what happens? He pulls out his dagger, and with might and main, he cuts that finger off, but in doing so, the force of the blow sends the ring and the finger flying, and as Providence would have it, it lands right in the lap of Lady Mary. Well, Mr. Fox stops what he's doing. He's bound and determined to have that ring, and as he's looking, scream! The lady wakes up out of her stupor. She's in great pain, and she cries out, and what does Mr. Fox do? He stops. He can come back any time for the ring. He grabs her by the hair and leads her off to the abattoir. Well, Lady Mary is no fool, and she makes good her escape on her horse, across 7 streams, through 7 valleys, and over 7 hills. Now, as Providence would have it, on the morrow was the day in which the engagement contract was to be signed. Now, on the morrow, Mr. Fox shows up promptly. Everything is ready, he says. He sits down at the table across from Lady Mary and her father, but she has placed her 2 twin brothers on either side of Mr. Fox. Now, Mr. Fox is a good judge of character, and he asks Lady Mary, why has your countenance fallen? And she says, I suffered last night in a dream about you. Pray tell, he says, maybe we can solve that. We can ease your mind. Lady Mary recounts her dream. I dreamed I got on my horse and rode to your castle, over 7 hills, through 7 valleys, and across 7 streams to that lovely castle. I entered the castle, but upon entering I saw that sign that said, be bold, be bold. Now Mr. Fox, he has a confused look on his face and says, may it never be. May it never be. But she continues, but in my dream, as I went into the courtyard, I saw another door, and it had a second sign that said, be bold, but not too bold. But I went in, through the hallway, up the stairs, through the gallery, and there was another door, the first door on the left, and there was a third sign. Be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood run cold. And I opened the door in my dream, and I saw bodies of young ladies and skeletons rotting, and they had been murdered, and their hair was all bloody, and their gowns were red with blood, and I fled. Well, at that, Mr. Fox says, "God forbid, may it never be!" But then Lady Mary stands up and casts that finger with the ring on it in front of him and says, "Yes, it is. It is you, you scoundrel." Well, at that, Mr. Fox decides it's time to make his escape. And as he springs up to head out the door, the two brothers are much faster than he, and they run him through with their swords. And so ends the tawdry tale of Mr. Fox.
Marriage is always a risky business, for you never know exactly what you're getting yourself into. But of course, for the colonists, it was particularly dangerous because it was harder to check up on people. And therefore, young people were counseled to stay within their community, where the betrothed's attributes and background could be better checked. And the story you just heard is an effective, if particularly violent, way of making that suggestion. Now, speaking of marriage and courtship, our next story tells another tale of forlorn love, but it also casts one of our most prominent founding fathers in a role that we don't usually see him in. So let us go to Chatham Manor.
So romantic. Oh my. You would not believe the most delicious gossip that I heard last night at dinner. It was absolutely spectacular, almost unbelievable. I myself could scarcely think that it might be possibly true. Oh, but I get ahead of myself. Let me introduce myself. My name is Miss Elizabeth McGovern. I happen to be a guest of the Honorable Mr. William Fitzhugh here at his beautiful home here on the Potomac, Chatham Manor. You know, I heard he built this place some 20 years ago. Can you believe he was actually very good friends with the former Prime Minister himself, Mr. Pitt? Oh my, but I digress. The dinner gossip. It was ever so spectacular. We've been enjoying this lovely dinner party here on these beautiful grounds all this week. We've enjoyed horseback riding and romps on the lake and all of these beautiful, beautiful things. And then last night, while I was sitting at dinner next to the most handsome and debonair young gentleman, he happened to share with me something he witnessed just the night before. Again, I could scarcely believe it. He said that he saw her. And I said, "My good man, whom are you speaking of? Who is she?" And he says, the lady in white. And I'm like, there's no one here in white. I'm the youngest young lady here, of course. And he said, no, she was a guest here some 20 years ago, also very young, and sent here in disgrace from her papa in England. Apparently, she had formed some sort of a mésalliance with a most unsuitable young man, and her papa sent her here to make her become further away so she would not become emotionally entangled. But as young lovers are wont to do, apparently he followed her here, and they began a most passionate and embroiled love affair. She was sneaking out to meet him and everything else, and they were making plans to get this, elope. So on the very night that she was getting ready to do it, she was all a-twitter. And of course, because you can never keep anything secret, the servants, of course, found out. And one particular servant happened, in his most indiscreet manner, to mention it to another one of the house guests. And would you guess who that was? None other than President Washington himself. Can you imagine the president staying here at Chatham? Of course, he wasn't the president then. He was only a general. Granted, the general of the Continental Army, but still. Apparently, for someone with such lofty friends as the Prime Minister of England, Mr. Fitzhugh apparently liked to entertain us colonials, I believe. Anyway, I digress. Back to the gossip. Can you believe he said that this young woman arranged to meet her illicit lover, which she was all so excited about how madly in love she would be and how glorious her life would become versus the dreaded arranged marriage that her father had planned for her. And of all things that should happen, would you believe she gets all of her things together, she escapes out into the early evening, much like this, and as she made it out to the edge of those bushes, right over there, all of a sudden, a tall, cloaked figure stood up around her, and she was completely terrified because it was not her lover. Do you know who it was? It was President Washington! Oh my, can you imagine? Oh, President Washington is so handsome and so debonair. Martha, I am so envious of you. Anyway, so apparently President Washington, while he was still the general, kept her from being able to run away with him. And our young woman goes home back to England, absolutely devastated because her young lover never met her that night. I'm sure her broken heart kept her from being able to partake in any way of what she wanted to do that evening. Maybe President Washington was trying to keep her from it. Who knows? But last year, on the anniversary of her death in England of all places, the rumor is that she vowed to return to Chatham to find her lover. And according to the gossip just last night, she did. Someone claims to have seen her. And so I'm sitting out here this evening hoping for my own glimpse of this lady in white. Won't this be the most delicious news? I will be the social coup of the season if I can tell my own real ghost story.
Well, that was quite an interesting story about Chatham now, wasn't it?
It certainly was, Mark.
Although I must say it's a little bit curious as to why would General Washington take such an interest in the love affair of a young girl, no matter how improprietous the relationship. Well, perhaps he learned something about the young man and felt it was his duty to protect her.
Well, you know, Washington was such a stickler for protocol, for one thing. Obviously, it must have been he felt so ashamed that a young girl would go against her father's wishes so blatantly. And then also, I thought maybe he's trying to protect the host, Fitzhugh, from not looking like such an inappropriate chaperone.
You might have something there. Washington was rather straight-laced in many ways, not like William Fitzhugh, that profligate. He expended his way right out of Chatham. Well, unless
What?
Well, you know, 6 years after the ghost first appeared, he just suddenly up and left his beloved home. At the time, most people assumed that his debts had finally caught up with him, but now I'm wondering if possibly the repeated appearances of the lady in white scared him away. Of course, that's been, 40 years now?
40 years now, yes.
It's 1828 now. Oh my, how time flies.
It does.
You know, I wonder, do you think any of our other founding fathers have had experiences with the spectral realm?
Well, you know, I think they have.
Really?
In fact, Benjamin Franklin, it is said that his ghost appears at the library of the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And it is said that the statue jumps up and actually does a jig throughout the streets, which you know must be very entertaining. But what we don't know is what is all the excitement about.
Well, there's no telling with that rascal.
It is true, very true.
But you know, I have heard that your deceased ancestor has been seen walking among the living, I believe.
Yes, Aaron Burr, Vice President of Thomas Jefferson.
And the killer of Alexander Hamilton, I believe.
Well, yes, we don't talk about that too much. But it is said that his ghost has been seen roaming through the West Village in New York City.
Really?
In fact, he's often seen at a restaurant called One If by Land and Two If by Sea. This restaurant is housed in his actual former carriage house.
Well, you know, our current president, Andrew Jackson, had an incident with a witch, they say.
Oh my gosh, do tell!
Well, he fought, of course, the famous Battle of New Orleans in 1814. And among his soldiers were 3 brothers, the Bell brothers. After the war, they went back to their homestead in Tennessee. Apparently, General Jackson owned some property in the general vicinity, and so he had kept up with them. Well, it soon got out that the 3 brothers were perplexed by a poltergeist of some sort. Yes, strange things were happening, yes, at the homestead. Things like invisible hands grabbing linens right off the beds in the middle of the night, and unexpected sounds and all kind of things. Well, you know how those soldier men are. They do keep in touch with one another. And so it got back to General Jackson, and he decided that he would go and see what was going on. So he and some of his entourage paid a visit.
What did they find?
Well, when they approached the property, the horses they were riding, as well as the horses carrying the wagons, refused to go any further. And apparently, apparently General Jackson rather jocularly said, must be the Bell Witch stopping us. And then he swears, according to the gossip, that he heard a disembodied female voice saying, "You may proceed." And all of a sudden, the horses had no more qualms about moving forward. Now it was quite a ways from the main road back to the homestead, actually many miles. And as they were going, it was nearing evening, and so General Jackson asked his entourage to just keep talking normally. So they were talking about Indians and politics and all, just to keep the atmosphere light.
Right.
Well, it got a little too light, because one of the men said, "Oh, we have not experienced the Bell Witch. It's because I am a witch tamer." And everyone said,
"Witch tamer?"
Yes, and they said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, witches do not like silver, and I took the precaution of bringing a silver bullet, and it is right now in my vest pocket." At that precise moment that he mocked the witch, he was thrown by unknown hands from his saddle, thrown into the dust, and then his head was going back and forth and back and forth, and he could feel unseen hands hitting him and kicking him. He was writhing on the ground, and the entourage and General Jackson didn't know what to do. Well, finally, he jumped up and took off running back to the main road, and all of the rest of the entourage, except for our brave General Jackson, went with him. We don't know exactly what happened that night, but General Jackson did spend the night there at the Bell homestead. And the next morning, however, right after dawn, he was seen all the way on the other side of the county on the road to Nashville. And I have been told that in the years since this happened, whenever discussion falls to the things in life we don't want to do,
Yes.
he always says, "I would rather face a regiment of British Army than to spend one more night with the Bell Witch."
Oh my. Fascinating.
The allure of the gamble, the hope for a windfall, the fear of loss, the adrenaline of the risk of knowing that all of your fortunes hang in the balance. Gambling was a favorite pastime, particularly for the gentlemen of colonial times, and it was said that Virginians particularly would gamble on anything. So it's no surprise that many of the ghost stories of the period pay a subtle and sometimes not so subtle tip of the hat to this favorite pastime, and also warn of the dangers of taking it to the extreme.
This is a tale of old Virginia as passed down to us by Emmeline Powers, lately of Williamsburg. As she tells the story, her dear friend Catherine Gamble, which is her married name, she had the sight. Now some of you might want to know what the sight is. Well, Catherine was a dreamer, and Catherine's dreams often came true. Not all of them, but many of them came true. Now, Emmeline loves to tell the story of one time when Catherine had a dream that didn't come out as they had expected. Now, they were young, and the pastor's wife had lost her ring, which had a beautiful pearl in it. And she loved that ring, and she so wanted it back that she offered a reward. Now you can imagine how those young girls so wanted a reward. I'm sure that Catherine went to sleep thinking about what she was going to spend that reward on. Well, that night she had a dream. First thing in the morning, she couldn't contain herself, found Emmeline, and told her that she had a dream that the pastor's wife, while making her famous cherry pie for the Sunday social after church, had somehow lost that ring into the cherry pie itself. Now that Catherine, once she got something into her head, it was hard to stop her. And she was determined that on Sunday, they would find a way to spirit that pie out the back and over the hill behind the church. And that they would very carefully take their little fingers at the edge of the crust, and that they would put that finger in there and just reach around to see if that ring was in that pie, and thinking they'd be able to push it back together and all would be well. Except for youthful exuberance, of course. And as they were putting those little pinkies in, pretty soon they crushed the crust, and that cherry juice flew all in their hair and all over their church dresses, and they broke out laughing. And as they're laughing and their heads are down, Emmeline sees some very large shoes, and as she looks up, there is that tall preacher man looking down at them, and he looked none too happy, I must say, because he loved that cherry pie, and he was looking forward to a piece of that pie that Sunday afternoon. Well, the point of Emmeline's story was that not all of Caroline's dreams came true. But now, as time would have it, Caroline's family moved westward to Richmond Town. And they remained good friends, and they corresponded regularly. Now, Emmeline tells a story that in one of Caroline's letters, Caroline said, "I had a dream last night, and I dreamed of my future husband and my children and where we would live." Now, Emmeline, knowing that she has the sight, kept that letter, treasured it. The years went by, and one day she got the call to come to Richmond Town for a wedding. And sure enough, Caroline's dream had come true. She had foreseen her husband. Now, that is a great story, but it doesn't end there. For Caroline's husband was a bit of a gambler. I think he was named Stephen Gamble, and he was a gambler. He would gamble on anything just for the fun of it. And interestingly enough, he was a man of great luck. He met Catherine, did he not? So he relied on his luck, and it did him well, and his business succeeded. The businesses he started all thrived. And so pretty soon, Miss Catherine found herself in a nice manor house and was part of the gentry at that point. Now, one eventful day, Miss Catherine had a dream that night, and she woke up in the morning in a fright. And she told her husband of her dream. And in the dream, as she related it to him, was that he went out for his normal work. He was on his horse when something spooked the horse. It reared up and threw him off, and Mr. Gamble hit his head on a rock and dies in the dream, never to see his wife and children again. She begged him, "Dear one, stay home today. You cannot go." And he said, "My dear, you know I don't place any reliance on your dreams. I trust to my luck." And no matter how she pled with him, through all those tears, he refused. He went to work in his normal way. Now, before he left, as he kissed his wife goodbye, he said to her, "I trust in my luck, and I promise you I will be back here by 2 o'clock this afternoon. You can count on it." And she hugged him, and off he went. Now, as you can imagine how this story works, Mr. Gamble, his horse was spooked. He was thrown off the horse, hit his head on a rock, and died. Now the men he was with, they gathered a wagon and took his horse and headed home. Now Miss Catherine was sitting in the drawing room, and she heard her husband's horse, recognized its clippity-clop. But then she also heard a wagon, which was out of place, for normally he had no wagon. She left the drawing room and went out into the courtyard, and she saw the horse, riderless, and behind it a wagon. And as she walked over to the wagon, she looked down, and there was her beloved husband. His head was bleeding profusely, and he was dead. And then the men who had brought him back, they noticed that she was all in black, and her children as well. And they asked, "Miss Catherine, why are you in black? Are you in mourning for someone?" And she said, "I dreamed this last night, and I knew that he was going to die. I begged him not to go, but he trusted in his luck. And now, wait a minute. That's the clock ringing in the hall. It's 2 o'clock. I guess we were both right. In my dream he dies and he's dead. But before he left me, he bet that he would be back by 2 o'clock. And you yourselves heard it. So he won his last bet."
Although it was the age of enlightenment when logic and reason were championed, the Revolutionary period was chock full of superstitions, and many were the tales that warned it was not wise to mock death, nor to avoid heeding the suggestions and superstitions and premonitions of family and friends. Our final 2 stories make these points most seriously.
Our story this evening takes place primarily in a tavern, but we will also have some other context. There's a hill, a church, and a cemetery, and this all takes place in the town called Yorktown. So we're in the tavern, it's early afternoon. A lot of the fellows are coming in, it's getting rather boisterous. The Guinness Stout is flowing, the heavy-duty ale is flowing, and everyone's talking and having a good time. But pretty soon, after a while, the conversation starts to narrow down, and it focuses no matter which table you're talking about. Everybody's talking about the murder that took place in a surrounding community. And it took place by a Yorktown man. He strangled several people with his bare hands. He was convicted, adjudicated, and hanged. And his body had been returned to here, to that graveyard right up on top of the hill, right across from the tavern where the church is. He was actually buried in unconsecrated soil because he was a murderer. And murderers, as we know, are going straight to hell. So he was isolated. The grave was fresh. As the guys kept drinking and the evening waned on, they started talking about strange things that were happening around the grave. Lights hovering over the grave. Strange noises emanating from the grave that could be heard in the rectory by the church. And even one fellow said that old Nick himself, the devil, had taken up residence there. And then a fellow stands up on top of a chair, knocks together some tankards and says, he happens to be the big gambler in town. He says, I have a wager. A purse of silver for any man here that will go up to the cemetery at midnight tonight, prove that he was there, he'll win this purse of silver. Who will take me up on this bet, this wager? Well, no one at the tavern would, until in the back, toward the fireplace, there was a rather rough guy, a ne'er-do-well. His name was Samuel Cobb, young guy. He said, you're a bunch of superstitious old women. I'll take the wager. I fear neither God nor devils. Well, with that, the gambler cleared off the main table, and he became the bookie. People came and bet on whether or not Samuel would be successful or would fail. That's how he made his money. But the purse of silver, there it was. So they had to have a plan, and here was the plan. They cut a stake out of firewood, they signed it, he would take the stake with him. He would go to the cemetery by himself, he would find it, he would knock the stake down into the ground, punch it into the ground, and then that was it. He would come home. If they saw the stake the next day, he won his purse of silver. Well, the betting took place, everyone had decided, and it was Samuel that was going to do it. About 11 o'clock that night, Samuel and some of his cronies got ready to walk up the hill. So they went up the hill to the church, and there at the church door, he turned around and said, you fools, you're all a bunch of fools. You're a bunch of scaredy cat women. You believe this nonsense. Tomorrow, I'll have a pocket full of silver, and I'll spend it on wine, women, and song. So he went through the gate and closed it. They left, and he headed down the pathway to the cemetery. It's a little cloudy. There's some starlight out. He can still see. He pulls his great coat around him because it's very cold. As he walks down the path, he can see off in the distance, there seems to be an isolated grave. Yep, that's it. He can see the fresh dirt. It's only been there 2 days. He comes down and he laughs, and what fools they are. Easy money. He plops down on the grave. I'll take the stake. I'll drive it in. He pounds it in the ground. And he says, well, in about 30 minutes, I'll be in my bed sound asleep. He starts to stand up, but he can't move. It's as though these clammy hands from underneath are holding him. His imagination starts running wild, and he starts crying out, Lord, the hands have me. They're starting to pull me into the ground, into hell itself. Help me, help me. And then there's nothing. Just the sound of the wind in the trees high on a hill in Yorktown. The next morning, his friends went to find him. They knocked on the house door, and his mother came and said he had not come in that night. So they rushed up to the graveyard, to the murderer's grave. And sure enough, there he was, cold and dead on the grave. They started to move him, and they realized that in his haste to put the stake in the ground and come back, he had punched it through the tail in his heavy coat, and he had pinned himself to the ground. So perhaps it wasn't murderous hands that were holding him. They took the body back to his mother, which in turn got taken to the mortuary. The local doctor came, examined the body. What was the cause of death? He said, who knows? Exposure to the cold. It was very cold that night. Maybe all the alcohol he had in his system. Maybe he had a heart attack because he had this horrible, frozen expression of terror on his face when they found him. There is a postscript to this story. The postscript is the doctor also looked at the stake. And when he looked at the stake, there was nothing visible. But he took out his magnifying glass and he checked it out, and he noticed there were two very faint, bloody handprints on the stake. He had checked the body. The hands were fine. There was no blood from the dead man, from Cobb. He never said anything about it. Well, how do we know about this? About 100 years later, his family, his relatives, found his book, where he booked all of his cases. And in there, he talked about this stake and how he couldn't explain these bloody handprints. Now, why didn't he say something to somebody? Well, maybe because he was a doctor. He's tied into the scientific community. Maybe that would have looked bad. So there you go. That's the story. Was it natural causes? Was it supernatural causes? You be the judge. And that's the rest of the story.
There was once a simple farmer and his wife. They were good, decent folk. They lived way out in the sticks, and they made their living from agriculture. They had different personalities. He was very pragmatic and logical. She was much more intuitive, and she was very superstitious, and that will figure into our story. She believed that there were malevolent forces all around the universe, so she had to have talismans and different types of wards to keep them from attacking her house and her loved ones. One day he was out loading the wagon, getting ready to go into town. He had loaded up his produce. He would take it in and trade with the townsfolk and get supplies to come back. She came out to him and she said, well, I really want you to postpone going into town. Well, he said, why? She said, well, I just got a bad feeling about this. I would think that death is about. Some omens have been surfacing. What are they? Well, for 2 nights in a row, roosters crowed at midnight. Oh, okay. And then our hound dog in the corner is baying and crying and with no apparent reason. And as I recall, you had a whole row of corn that you missed up in the north side. He said, yeah. What else? She said, well, then I had a premonition. I had a premonition. Death won't be denied a companion. Death won't be denied a companion once he's gone to the other side. I said, what in the Sam Hill does that mean? She said, I don't know, but it's got death in it. Don't go. He said, dear, I love you. I'm going to take that under consideration, but I'm heading into town. And so he harnessed up the horse, wagon, got it ready. He said, I'll be back late this evening. And he headed out. But when he got to town, he sold his produce quickly. He traded, he bartered. He got exactly what he wanted. And as he was going back, he was getting ready to leave and go back home, he noticed that there was a full moon coming. Sun was low in the west. But he knew the route. It wouldn't be a problem. And he headed back. He'd been riding for, maybe they'd gone about 2 miles. And everything was fine. And then as he came around the bend, he thought he saw an individual standing by the road and beckoning to him. He thought this was rather peculiar because it was late at night, it was in a remote area, and the guy didn't have a horse. So as he got closer, his horse spooked and broke and ran down the road, and he couldn't control the horse and the wagon for about another 1.5 miles. But he wondered what that fellow had been doing out in the middle of nowhere with no horse. So they rode for a little bit longer, and he came around another bend, and sure enough, it looked like the very same man was standing off to the side and was beckoning to him. Oh, it can't be the same guy. Maybe it's a trick in the moonlight or something. So as he got closer, sure enough, as soon as his horse got wind of the man, it broke again, and down the road they go maybe 2 miles. But this was quite curious to him. Was this guy the same guy? Was it a different guy? Couldn't be. Again, it must have been a trick of the moonlight, the shadow, whatever. So it wasn't that much longer. He sees the man standing right by the side of the road. And now he's starting to spook out. He remembered what his wife had said. She said, death won't be denied as long as there's a soul out to be collected. Well, with that, he cracked his whip, he gave the command, and the horse and the wagon shot by. But it was kind of weird because as he went by the man, he felt his gaze, and it was very unsettling. Well, after he'd been riding again, he was getting closer to home, and he noticed that the wagon, there seemed to be some weight in the wagon, but he felt okay. He was almost home. He figured he'd actually tricked fate. But then the wagon the springs started moving. And he turned and he looked, and there in the back of the wagon was this solitary figure. He was calm, the figure. He was peaceful. He was pallid in complexion, and he had a big grin on his face because the moonlight shone on it. And he realized who this was. So he had to come up with a plan. He had to come up with it quickly. It was dangerous. It might fail. But with all his strength, he leaped off the buckboard, leaped to the horse. What he was going to do, it was a good plan. He was going to reach back with his knife and cut the strapping that connected the horse to the wagon. And as he tried to do that, the horse, who was so startled, bucked up, and he fell backwards and down in between the horse and the wagon, and the horse is taken off pell-mell. He's caught in a web of straps and harness and equipment. What is he going to do? Every time he tries to adjust, he sinks down lower and lower, and he can't get his right footing. And pretty soon, he's right on the deck. A wagon, runaway wagon, no driver, horse crazed out. Soon, the horse and the wagon come to a stop right outside his homestead. His wife runs out, and she sees him, bloody, mutilated, and lifeless. You know, you can't outrun death. Death can't be cheated. But parenthetically, all of us will have our rendezvous with death, won't we? As the good book says, it is accounted unto man once to die, and then the judgment. Amen and amen.
Thank you for being our companions tonight in Ghosts of the Revolution. I'm J. Lenora Bressler, And on behalf of the cast and crew, our chapter regent, Suzanne Ellsworth, and all the members of the Lakeland chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, we thank you for your support by your participation in this fundraising initiative. The motto of the DAR is for God, home, and country, and our mission is to inspire patriotism, civic engagement, and an appreciation for the founding principles of our great nation. And now, finally, a benediction, a blessing, appropriate as we go our separate ways. Against goblins and ghoulies and things that go bump in the night, the good Lord preserve us. Yikes! And good night.